Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this episode 4 of the Big Conversation speaker series produced by Medway Innovation Institute. It's great to have you all here. Thank you for coming on. I'm sure everyone's just getting settled, so I'll do the corporate piece first, and then we're going to get into the really exciting conversations today with our guests. Today is produced by the Medway Innovation Institute. I'm Harvey McEnroe. I'm the Strategic Commander and Winter Director for the Trust and for the ICP. I'm really honoured today to be speaking around how embracing difference as a topic, but broadly around learning difficulties and autism is part of our day job, part of our lives, part of our work. And on a personal basis, very much about our personal experiences. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I should say, to find out more about the Institute and the work that's being led here by the team, do head over to medwayinnovationinstitute.com. I think there's lots of atting and things that happen on Twitter as well, and we'll get all those links out in the chat box today as we go, so that you guys can see all the fantastic work that's happening here at Medway and across the Medway Institute. Today we're going to be joined by some really great guests in the form of Miss Ginny Bowbrick, a consultant vascular surgeon here at the Trust, Dr. Mary Doherty, a consultant anaesthetist and founder of the Autistic Doctors Institute, International, and Matt Clifton, the CEO of BMIX, Kent and Medway-based social enterprise, supporting people with learning difficulties and autism into work and into education, which is such a fantastic program. I won't do justice to their programs of work, and I'm looking forward to them telling us about the great work that they're doing through today. The topic that we'll be discussing today focuses on how we embrace difference and what we can be doing differently to support our colleagues with learning difficulties and autism in the workplace. I mentioned a moment ago about my personal connection to this. Family member with autism and his struggles have been a real part of how I've become involved, and I'm now the Trust's executive sponsor for this work, and I'm so privileged to be working closely with Ginny and the contacts and colleagues she has nationally and internationally now on this topic. There'll be an opportunity today for colleagues to ask questions, and for those on the MS Teams to bring in questions for the panel. Please can I ask that you specify who the question is for and whether you'd like it answered during the Q&A or in the follow-up, because our experts will be able to do a little bit of both. I'd like to bring in now one of our esteemed colleagues, Ginny Bowbrick, to walk us through the campaign she's been leading and talk to us a little bit about her connection with this work. Ginny, over to you.
Hello. So as Harvey said, I'm a consultant vascular surgeon at Medway, but outside of the hospital, I'm also a mother of 4, and my twins, who are now 14, are autistic with severe learning disabilities. About a year ago, it was the Panorama programme about Walton Hall that I watched, and that was heartbreaking. And I was in tears by the end of it, seeing what had happened at this institution, which, although it was a private institution, was funded by the NHS. But I know that when I come to work, that my colleagues, 99.9% of us in the NHS, are there to make a difference, to do our best for our patients. And I felt that in some ways we needed to reassure our patients and their families that we want to help and do the best that we can. And when I looked at the curricula that we all have studied under, the majority of what we learn for autism or learning disabilities revolves around consent and mental capacity. And yet there's so much more to it that we need to know. And I wanted to create a campaign which had 2 facets to it. First of all, to give us some more information on key points and signposts to where to get more information. And then on the other side of that, to reassure our patients and their families. It took about a year to evolve. The name changed, got a lot of feedback from the actual autistic community and from Twitter, because if you're going to create a campaign, you need to ask those people that you're doing it for what they want you to say and to tell people. And we're very lucky that we, along the way, met so many interesting people, Anna Kennedy, Paula McGowan, Baroness Hollins, and created the Different Not Less campaign. And with it, we created the logo, the symbol, the leaflet, the Z card, and working closely with Baroness Hollins with her Beyond Words charity, which is a charity that's created an app and books to help with understanding for people with learning disabilities and autism. And I know it works because the one that was about going to the dentist, I gave for my youngest twin to go through. He wouldn't go to the dentist. The carers worked through the book with him and he successfully went to the dentist. So I know that the work that she's done is successful and does help. And you can download the app onto your phone, and there you've got your phone and you can go through this with the patients. But there's a lot of misnomers. For example, that people with autism, 60% of people with autism do not have a learning disability, and therefore they have full capacity, they have the full ability to understand and to make their own decisions. And yet when they become ill, it's much more challenging for them. Hospitals are full of sensory input, the lights, the noise, the people. It becomes very stressful, and the ability to communicate becomes harder for people with autism. And we need to understand that. People aren't just being difficult. They just need to have the time to be able to process what's going on around them, and we need to understand that. So there's a lot within that we did. We produced the leaflet, which I've got one here, and the Z card, the badge, and I've got one on, and launched in August. And it was amazing when we launched, the response we got. You tell people the figures about mortality for people with autism and learning disabilities, and they're shocked. And when I put it into the terms, the first time I presented this in the grand round, I stood there and said to my colleagues that my eldest son will live for 25 years longer than my twins, and only because they have autism and severe learning disabilities, and for no other reason. And it's hard as a parent to accept that. So the whole reason for doing this was to try and change that, or to try and in some way improve those figures. The leader reports, a lot of work's been done with the Kippold and leader reports, and looked at why this happens. And a lot of it boils down to preconceptions, inequality of care, understanding, listening to families. And that's why we came up with the 3 words. It's basically, we ask people to care, to listen, and to understand. And that's all we ask. And if we can do that, if we can involve the families, if we can make people feel that we understand more and treat with equality without any preconceptions, then hopefully we can in some way help with these figures. I've met so many interesting people, as I say, and I was very fortunate that after the campaign launched and we were within the local press and we were even on BBC South East, which really challenged me being interviewed on BBC South East, but I managed it. And the twins, actually, they saw me and they were jumping around the lounge, but they saw me being interviewed. There's Mummy on the television. So that was great. That made me know that I'd done something good, because they were so proud of me that day, seeing me on the television. And I met Matt and I met Mary, and I've met so many interesting people. And I met Matt, and I went to a meeting and met his colleagues, and it was a lovely conversation. But for Matt, with the work that he does, actually, I said to him, you give me hope that for my boys in the future, that they're going to, there is life after being at school, and the work that he does is amazing. So, Matt, do you want to tell everyone a bit more about it?
That's such a lovely introduction, Ginny. And we enjoyed that course so much. I had a number of colleagues with learning difficulties, some of whom are on our board of directors and are at the leading edge of some of the campaigning and influencing work that we try to do. And we talked about some of the experiences people have had when they've needed healthcare. That's sometimes been a difficult experience, and as you said, it's not at all because healthcare professionals don't care. It's always because there's just some gap in understanding and know-how, the different access needs, the support needs that somebody may have. As you mentioned, the factors like the environment, the sensory overload that can affect people in a healthcare setting. So we really valued that conversation and the campaign that you've been launching. It's terrific. It's exactly what we're all about. I have the privilege of running a social enterprise called BMIX in Kent and Medway. It's been my job for about 7 years, but our history goes back 19 or so in the county. And we set up as an independent business, coming out of a frustration at the way that public sector services were typically run in top-down and limiting ways, in ways that gave people very limited aspirations for their lives, hopes for the future, the kind of things, Ginny, that you mentioned for your sons, really limiting people largely to the prospect of a future in social care, but not in work. And if in work, in segregated work, not in the thicker things where everybody else is living their lives and enjoying their work and part of the community, valued as an equal in society. So my predecessor and a small group of other people just kind of broke away from all of that, tried to do something very different, and what we like to call co-produced, which simply means we work alongside people with learning difficulties and autism as genuine equals. It's a very simple, pure concept. The idea is simply to travel alongside people in a way that just brings the support they need, so that they can enjoy and sustain full choice and control about their lives in the way that most of the rest of us take for granted. And all our work has sprung from that simple principle. One of our big passions, particularly in more recent years, has been to support people into employment. Again and again, the people that we support say they want to work. They would love to have the opportunity to work. They want to be recipients of charity, dependent on social care for the rest of their lives. Just simply want to go out and contribute and be a part of the workforce. So we've worked very hard to develop our approach to that kind of support, building a bridge between people with learning difficulties and autism and employers, and aiming to support both to create the best possible match, so that the people that we support can move on from our support, ideally with no support, fully independent, supported in the same way any employer is supported by their line manager and colleagues in the workplace, and contributing as assets to an employer, not as people that we're kind of asking for a particular kindness to be shown towards. So that's the approach and the values that we've worked on, particularly over the last 6 to 7 years. And 5 years ago, we began just such a wonderful partnership with Medway Council, developing a model called supported internships. Internships as a word has had a bit of a bad press in recent years, with the notion that people are being exploited to some degree to work with no pay. But in our use of the word, and with that term supported internship, what we create is a 1-year program in partnership with an employer, whereby a young person recently leaving secondary education goes into the workplace and learns on the job with an employer, unpaid, because they're still in formal full-time education, but through that opportunity has the chance that they need to really show that employer what they can do, what they can bring, and for the employer who perhaps hasn't considered the different kind of talent pool that we want to offer, it's getting a chance to encounter firsthand that young person with their particular unique qualities and their support needs, and learn just what's involved, what additional support is available to them from organisations like us, and also from the wider system, to make that partnership between employee and employer a huge success, sustainable for the long term, and move into not just a job but a lasting career. And we've been delighted that we've just begun building a partnership with Medway NHS Foundation Trust to create 5 internships in a range of roles: facilities management, catering and ward hosting, that kind of thing. And we're thrilled about that because of the relevance to Ginny's campaign and the way that people are clearly going to be valued as colleagues within that healthcare workforce. And we're looking forward so much to all that's going to mean for those young people. So I think that's hopefully painted enough of a picture, Harvey, of us and what we get up to.
Thanks, Matt. It's amazing work, and it's great to hear all the great work that's gone, but also the fantastic asset that seems to now be building in regards to the work that's happening here at Medway, building on the work that you've achieved at the council. Speaking of sort of assets and in the healthcare system, I wonder if Mary, you could come in and talk a little bit about your work and the great things you're doing in the context of in the medical profession, particularly. Are you free to give us some views on that?
Thanks, Harvey. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to talk about the work of Autistic Doctors International, which is the organisation that I founded a year and a half ago now. I'm really excited to hear about the Different Not Less campaign and the work that Matt's doing with BMIX. It's just, honestly, I was so excited because what that's going to do is that's going to make it possible for our existing colleagues who are autistic, who are working alongside us every day, and we may not know, but it's going to make it possible for people to be openly autistic, because being at work and trying to hide our autistic traits or trying to pretend that we're neurotypical, it takes so much energy. My colleagues have absolutely no idea how much effort and energy it takes for me to seem like part of the team on a daily basis, and not having to do that just makes life so much easier. But my story is, my son, who's now 12, he was diagnosed when he was about 6. Which is quite late, really, given his presentation, but that was because I didn't see any of the red flags that would signify autism as anything but typical kids, because that's kind of how I was, and that's how my people in my family were, and it was very common for me. So it was quite late. But then after he was diagnosed, I realised, well, I certainly also see the world through an autistic lens, in the same way. And I received my own diagnosis soon afterwards, which probably it's about 7 years now at this stage. Yeah, and I found myself, I found the online and autistic community, and I just found that absolutely amazing. Just being able to find my tribe was just so freeing. It was so validating. But then I did find that I needed medical peers. I was really craving connections with other doctors who are autistic, and I just couldn't find anybody. Now, in fairness, I struggled to find even parents who were autistic as well at that time, but I just couldn't find any other autistic doctors. But I knew I couldn't be the only one. There had to be more. And luckily I met a friend and colleague, Dr. Shirley Moore, who had been doing some work in this area, and Shirley first asked me to present with her at the European Association for Physician Health, which a conference in Oslo. And we first talked together about being autistic and being doctors. And it had just never been talked about before. And that really started a conversation. So we started the organisation, Autistic Doctors International. Like, we started with about 6 people, I think. I remember being really excited when we got to 30. Now we're over 200. And it's just growing rapidly. And what I find whenever I talk about it, we get the tentative messages afterwards. I think I'm one of you. Can I join? How do I join? people who have been so isolated throughout their lives, and just feeling like just needing that connection, not realizing, sometimes not even realizing that the underlying issue is autism, because what happens is people tend to struggle with other issues, anxiety, depression, there's a lot of misdiagnosis happens, bipolar disorder sometimes, borderline personality disorder, that's a particularly common misdiagnosis for autistic women. But for people who realize and then get an accurate diagnosis and are able to connect with other colleagues, it's incredibly validating. So peer support is mostly what we do. We've got into advocacy as well. So we're now making links with various colleges. We've done a lot of work with the NHS Practitioner Health Service, and they've sent us quite a referred people who present to their service. They would have referred some people on for diagnosis and then on to us for support. So we've really active Facebook group, WhatsApp groups. We have several subspecialty groups. Mostly our biggest group, I think, is GPs. Yeah, so our biggest specialty group is GPs, and then psychiatrists and anaesthetists are kind of neck and neck after that. But we have very few pathologists, contrary to the stereotypes. We have a couple of surgeons recently, and it's just growing and growing. And what I'm noticing is at the very beginning, people would take a long time after hearing about us to get in touch. And now I'm noticing that it's getting more, it's getting shorter and shorter. And that's good, because that's people struggling for less time. We've supported a few people through career changes. We're supporting some people out of medicine and some people considering going back into medicine. We've helped people get through exams. We've advocated with training bodies. And the other thing we're interested that we're doing as well is we're looking at barriers to healthcare for the autistic community. So it's not just about the doctors. This was research that I became involved in, again, as Ginny said, hearing about the mortality figures, because people like me, people without a learning disability, our life expectancy is significantly shorter, and I started looking at why that might be. So myself and 3 colleagues from the Autistic Doctors Group, we're hoping to have a paper out on that soon, just looking at the barriers. Difficulty with the telephone is the #1 barrier for autistic adults, which isn't even something that I knew, even though I know that I have difficulty using the telephone. So we're hoping to have some work out on that soon. We're looking at we're looking at the International Conference for Physician Health is happening next year. Now it's just announced that it's gone online, but it was supposed to be in London in April. And we were really looking forward to that, because we had a workshop on supporting autistic doctors. We have a workshop at that, so we'll do that online, and also a poster. And to learn more about it, there's a couple of things coming out. Shirley has already written an article in the Lancet Psychiatry, so you could look up autistic doctors in Lancet Psychiatry. I have something coming out in Anesthesia News, I think next month or the month after. And also I was honoured to be asked by Claire Gerada to write a chapter in her recent book on doctors and their mental health. So we're just starting to raise awareness. And all of this is to do with just raising awareness so that people find it easier to come out as autistic, to find connection, to be able to talk about it, because that will then make it so much easier for our patients. And ultimately, that will increase the morbidity, or that will benefit them from our patients from a morbidity and mortality perspective. But also, more importantly, for the whole autistic community, just to reduce the stigma associated with the condition, because that in essence is the biggest problem. That's why people don't disclose, that's why people hide, and that is the greatest thing that we really need to battle. We need to battle this tragedy narrative that somehow autism is the worst possible diagnosis to receive. It's not at all. We need to move to a strengths-based approach, and the work that we're doing together here and the work that you're doing in Medway will really benefit the community in that way.
Mary, thank you. That's so powerful, and I think it's amazing to hear you speak about the work you've done with your peers and those colleagues that are coming into the profession, as well as those that might be maybe not in the best profession for them and something is different for them that is needed. But I think it's great, and it's an interesting group that you say fall into those categories. I might not have picked, like you say, the immediate stereotypes there, but it's fascinating. And I since I met you a couple of weeks ago, I have looked into the work you're doing, and I'd encourage people on the call today to do that. It's such an interesting piece, and I suppose this draws us to the section of the conversation today around some of the questions the panel could answer. And one of the things I thought I might kick off with is a question from one of our viewers around, as recruiting managers, what can we do to make applications and interview processes more accessible? I think this is such a key piece, and I wonder if we come to Matt first and then Mary on that to get your context, and then maybe bring in Ginny as well on the context you and I have been discussing about a speaking up guardian for colleagues internally within the trust. Maybe if you could bring an MFT context to it. But Matt, what's your view on how we can improve that for recruiting managers to help people with LD and autism access?
Yeah, the approach that we find works most effectively is to move away from the standard interview format, which is really quite a potentially alienating experience for people with learning difficulties and autism applying for a job, and quite anxiety inducing often, and typically actually not directly related to the job being applied for anyway. And we really value working with recruiters on approaches such as work trials, the chance to kind of get hands-on with a job and demonstrate the skills that people have to bring. Then it's the accessibility of information as well, particularly with learning difficulties. So it's approaches such as easy read versions of job ads and application forms, approaches such as giving people the chance to perhaps video their application instead of having to write it. I mean, those are creative and imaginative ways to approach it, but in doing so, you begin to open up that additional talent pool. And as Mary said, it's built on a strengths-based approach to seeing what people with learning difficulties or autism have to bring.
Thanks, Matt. That's really helpful. Mary, bringing in your experience, perhaps as someone who's interviewed in these settings, but also as a senior clinician, anything to add to what Matt said on this one?
Yeah, I think the thing to say about that is that anything that helps autistic candidates in an interview will help everybody. For example, asking for their questions in advance, for example. We had that recently with one of our members was going for an interview and was asking for suggestions. And that's the thing that was suggested by the group. And luckily the trust was happy to give that, but everybody got them. And that benefits everybody. The other thing that is an issue for our members is going through training. So not just interviews for jobs, but also at the transition points in training and structured exams and ARCP panels, that sort of thing. There are accommodations that sometimes are needed for people to get through those points. But again, understanding of those involved, awareness and understanding is definitely the most important issue. Because quite often people, if they don't understand the way that an autistic person communicates, it can be misinterpreted, and that can make things very difficult for an autistic person to pass through, say, a training stage, for example. So we've had to make representations to some of the colleges. For example, we've had somebody actually released from training because they were autistic. I won't say which college, but with that, just purely because of stigma. But what we were able to do was we were able to get that decision overturned and get an apology for that doctor, because it was all down to misunderstanding. It's not necessarily prejudice, it's purely misunderstanding. So that's why raising awareness is just so important.
Thanks, Mary. And I think both examples there talk at the root of what we're saying. Like Ginny has introduced, it's not that it has to be less or something completely off the mark. It's that it's different, and that the core of that is that we support access and those individuals who need it to be that, to get the best out of them. I wonder, Ginny, building on that, could I a bit about that question, but also looking at the question around how can we describe some simple things we as a hospital can do to improve this for our patients as well? Could you pick that question up as well, Ginny?
Tying in the two, what I would say is, and a lot of the feedback I had from the actual autistic community was talking on the telephone is incredibly hard, and it's picking up social cues. So being able to read someone's face, to be able to pick up the social cues, even like when do I talk, when do you talk, the back and forth of conversation. So within the NHS, we're moving to a more virtual world. We're doing a lot of telephone clinics, but actually that's incredibly difficult for our patients who are autistic, and would also be difficult for our patients with learning disabilities who will need more time to be able to process that information. So I think we need to retain the ability for these for people to have face-to-face clinics if they prefer and wish to have that. And again, with interviews, that things aren't done over the telephone, that they're given the ability to be seen face-to-face. From the perspective of how we can help, and what we were discussing yesterday, Harvey, was to have, one of the things when I stood in and we were launching the campaign in the trust, was the number of people who work in our trust who came to say to me, I have a son, a daughter, a grandchild, a relative who has autism or who has learning disabilities, and there were so many. And first of all, it was for a lot of them, it felt like it was the first time they'd actually said it or told anyone at work. But it was also from the point of view that we started discussing that, and we just started discussing the difficulties, the joys as well. There are plenty of joys and pleasures, and the boys have given me a totally new way of looking at life that I never had before. But there can be frustrations, and it occurred to me that for us and well-being for our staff would be to have someone within the trust who you could go to, just have 5 minutes sometimes in a day that you need to offload to, or you need some information, or you need some advice, along the lines of one of our Speaking Up guardians, but a guardian for us to have someone in that trust to go and discuss those matters with. And I'm talking to our Chief of People tomorrow, Leon Hinton, about creating such a post for our staff. And I think that lends itself as well to have someone as a key for people who hopefully the trust is going to be having more people within the trust who will be able to feel they can speak up and say they have autism or say they have a learning disability, and they'll be that person they can go and link with and talk to. So I think that's our sort of approach to that at the moment to help.
Thanks, Ginny. So colleagues, I'm mindful we've got a few more questions, so I'm going to keep coming back to the panel if that's all right, and just prompt us on a couple of these as we go. Laura's asked, and her role is as a clinical systems training lead. She's wondering, is there what could we be doing or considering to do more to ensure that we're creating the right learning environments for colleagues with autism? I wonder, Matt, is that something that you've given thought to in the BMIX brief, and give us a sort of summary about how that might be considered?
Yeah, and it's integral to what we do, because we educate as well as support. So we have our own classroom settings, and we're training, we're educating, typically in the kind of core functional skills that the young people we support are going to need in any workplace. And I think that the most hopefully useful thing that I can say about that is that it's people with lived experience themselves. It's people like Mary who are best placed to identify the things that will enable them to learn most effectively. And parents like Ginny as well are just going to have that direct sensitivity to what's going to work. So, for example, when we're setting up an environment in which young people with learning difficulties or autism are going to learn, it's crucial that we have the conversation with them to say, look, come into this space, tell us how it feels. The acoustics, the sound in this space, the lighting, how does that affect you? Is it helping you be calm, to be able to focus, to be able to concentrate? What's distracting you? What's affecting you? I mean, I know that I just will not, whatever knowledge I can build up, I'm just not going to be able to sort of sense that and have that first-hand awareness that lived experience brings. And that's where we hope, for example, with the kind of internships that we're working with the Trust to create, there'll be an increasing number of colleagues who are not only doing the job that they've been given to do, but are also there on hand as people with lived experience to be able to advise and comment on those kinds of questions.
Thanks for that, Matt. So some helpful comments in the conversation piece, particularly from a colleague who is an F1 doctor with autism, saying how important it is to be interviewed in familiar environments, and for that to be something we should be considering, and to ensure that they feel comfortable. I think to Mary's point, that's again a core piece of interviewing anyone, I should say, isn't it? And I think we should probably be valuing that feedback really closely, and probably something Ginny and I can take back to Leon from our people perspective. Jack's asked a question. What would you say everybody can and should do in their day-to-day lives to help battle stigma? Mary, what's your view on that in Jack's question?
Yeah, stigma, it's the biggest issue that we face. Get to know autistic people, make some autistic friends. Challenge bias when you see it. Often we hear people being discussed, or patients being discussed in ways that are not really appropriate. Call that out, challenge. And most of all, I think, create an ethos within a department where it is perfectly fine to come out and say, hey, I'm autistic. Those lights are wrecking my head. Perfectly fine to be our true, authentic autistic selves, because that's the most important thing. And I think that comes from top down. It needs, that really does come through an entire department, when at management level there is that acknowledgement of neurodiversity, and just that respect for difference, that respect for diversity. That's the best way to challenge stigma, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary.
Can I just add a footnote to such helpful comments from Mary, just with respect to learning difficulty, because I know my colleagues would want to say something so simple, but too often doesn't happen, and it's talk to the person directly themselves. There can often be this reflexive talking to a parent or a carer supporter. Stigma's broken down by talking to the person themselves, looking them in the eye, and just opening up the conversation directly, and respecting their basic dignity as a person.
Again, such a core value to how we should be presenting ourselves in all our interactions with colleagues and patients. But I think more important, isn't it, that we do that in this context? Ginny, there's a question for you, and I think it's a very apt one post our conversations yesterday, about where are you hoping and planning to take Different Not Less as a campaign? Where does it go next?
Well, I'd like to say that let's take over the world, but we'll start with Kent. But from my perspective, I want to spread the message, because I think it's a simple message, and I want to spread this to other trusts from the perspective of giving the key messages and the signposting and the key concepts. And from just relating to that other question that was asked, how can we, for what we can do, I think, having the role models like Mary there is very important. But with our patients, we need to accept that we need to learn how to communicate in different ways. We need to give more time, we need to be prepared to find different ways to explain things to patients, whether it's drawing diagrams, books, letters, and all sorts of things. So, and this is what we drew out in the campaign of finding different ways to communicate and how to signpost people to different things. I mean, one of the issues that I get very upset about is hearing about pain. And when I set up some threads on Twitter as to what I wanted people to us to know, from the autistic community wanted us to know, was the heartbreaking tales about I don't tell people I'm in pain and people don't expect me to be in pain because. And you look at the leader reports and people who were on palliative care who were unable to communicate with their learning disabilities were less likely to be receiving analgesia than those that could. I think the figures varied between 38% if they could communicate and 12% if they couldn't, but those patients must have been in agony. So it's finding different ways. There are different, and the leaflet was able to give people different tools to use to assess pain. So that's what I want to do. I want to spread this information so that these concepts that we have can change. And I want to start in Kent, and then I hope that we can spread this further within the country. I mean, you know, in the NHS, we like a campaign with some key points and we like a badge, and that's why we've done this. It's very much to complement the new mandatory training, which is Oliver McGowan's training that's coming in next year, which will be mandatory. And it's not to replace that, it's to complement it. And that's where we're going. Sorry, I could talk forever about this.
No.
So I'm really sorry. You have to tell me to shut up.
We want you to talk forever about it. It's fantastic, and I probably should have ended on that question because it's a great next step. But look, more content on this will be coming out, and more on the campaign will be coming out. There's a few more questions I just want to get covered. I'm conscious of time, and I think we're overrunning. But look, let's hope that our masters will let us continue a bit. Mary, there's a great question here from Sue. She says, how do we help a struggling colleague if we suspect autism but aren't their mentor or senior professional involved? What's your views about how we could support colleagues in this context?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's really difficult. It can be quite sensitive, and again, the reason that it's difficult is it goes back to the stigma. It would be so much easier to just go up to a colleague and say, hey, I think, you know, that mole looks a bit dodgy. Do you think you should get it checked out? Then, hey, I think you're autistic. Do you think you should go and get an assessment? It's much more difficult, yeah. But at the same time, if somebody is struggling and it's clearly due to issues related to autism, then I think we have a professional responsibility to address it, particularly in a situation where awareness and understanding is not necessarily widespread throughout the department and you're the only one that sees it. In that situation, what I've done, and I've been in that situation, is I have talked about autism, I've talked about my son, I've talked about my own diagnosis, and given the colleague an opportunity to consider whether or not, well, first of all, whether they know they're autistic and just haven't said anything, and whether they suspect it, whether they know anything about it at all. Because ideally, it's best if it comes from the doctor themselves. But if that's not possible, I believe that we have an obligation, particularly if there are career implications. And again, I've been in that situation, and that's really how I started talking about all of this, because it might be necessary to speak to supervisors and say, look, you know, there's something going on there. This isn't just anxiety, for example. And the thing is, there are some really simple things that can make an enormous difference in the context of a professional working day, that can really benefit people. So I think referring for a diagnosis, the practitioner health service are very autism aware at this point, so that would be a great role to suggest for somebody, or great route to suggest for somebody. But no, definitely don't ignore it.
Okay, thanks, Mary. That's really helpful, and I think hopefully that links back in with the work that Ginny's talking about with Leon tomorrow for our championing of this. So there's a couple of other questions. I'm gonna try and get as many as I can over the line. Jane has asked, great to have Jane on, our clinical lead for innovation. Is there anything more that we could be doing to support patients and visitors with LD and autism within crit care? I wonder who wants to tackle this. Ginny, that's probably a you, isn't it? What's your views on that?
Well, I think that it doesn't matter whether you're in critical care or whether you're on the wards. I think the same fundamental concepts that apply. It's the communication with the patient, the listening to the carers. And I think I've said this before, that with my twins, they're limited in how much they can talk, limited, not non-verbal, you know what I mean, they're limited in how much they can talk, but I can tell you if they're in pain, whereas they may be sitting there with no expression of it. So it's very important to get that view of the responses that you're seeing in your patient from the care and the family who know exactly what's going on. And it's not to make assumptions about quality of life. We do that so much as professionals. We assume that because we judge people's quality of life by our own quality of life. But I can tell you that my twins I think they have a better quality of life than I do with everything they do and get up to. And we make too many assumptions about that. And then we base how we're going to treat people on our own assumptions of their quality of life. So I think the challenges within critical care would be that they're going to be, it's the environment that they're in. It's how can you change that environment? It's the noise, it's the lights. And actually noise for people who are autistic can actually cause physical pain. You see one of the twins has always got his hands over his ears because he's blocking out the noise. So maybe you could darken the lights, maybe you could try and make it quieter, limit the number of people who are moving through the room, just to try and reassure them. Things like weighted blankets, actually, some autistic people find, my twins don't, but weighted blankets can be helpful. Maybe that's something you could think of introducing, so it's quite soothing to have that feeling of compression around them. But really, if you ask the family, they'll tell you how that person, what they need and what reassures them. So that would be my answer, but I'm sure Mary has some views on that, particularly as an anaesthetist.
Yeah, Mary, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a huge need for research in the area. There's very, very little, and there's very little written or published about autism and critical care. It is an area that really concerns me, and it's something that I would love to research if I can find suitable collaborators. So if you know anybody with an interest, please pass them my way.
Sure, that's something the Institute can think about. So, Mary, thanks for that. I'm mindful of time, and there's a question from Jackie that I want to pose to each of the panel if I can. But I might take it in the context. So the highest priority things that the trust and the wider health system, and Matt can bring some of that context, I'm sure, can take forward to improve. Jackie said the inpatient experience, but I'd like to broaden that to both patient and staff experience if I can. So perhaps for those with LD and or autism. So if I come to each of you, you choose whether or not you want to speak from a patient or a staff perspective. Matt, you first. What do you think is the priority or the top priorities in your context?
Yeah, I'm going to try and combine the two actually, just briefly, because I'm going to bring it back to our strapline. So our company name is Be Mix, and the B is reflected in our strapline: be seen, be heard, belong. It's the visibility, it's the normalizing of the presence of people with learning difficulties and autism in a workforce that can prove so powerful. And then, as I mentioned earlier, bringing that direct access to advice about the accessibility, the right approaches to healthcare within the setting. You've got somebody there with lived experience who can speak firsthand to what works, what affects people, and what will enable people to have the best experience possible.
Thank you, Matt. That's excellent. Mary, thoughts on that aspect and the question?
Yeah, from a staff point of view, I think the most important thing, the highest priority, is awareness and understanding, such as will come from the Different Not Less campaign, so that it's perfectly acceptable to just be openly autistic and have no fear of negative career consequences. And then that will enable that knowledge and awareness to be shared with our colleagues and our patients, and ultimately benefit the entire healthcare population.
Thank you. And Ginny, last word from you on this.
I think as healthcare professionals, we need to acknowledge that our patients with learning disabilities and autism do have fears about being in hospital. They understand the figures of younger age for mortality. And obviously, and I think I'm pretty fearful about that. If I was told that my life expectancy was going to be less for no other reason than that diagnosis. I had one of the tweets I had was from an autism advocate who said she was in hospital for a week and a half, and she's autistic, she's an advocate, and she didn't dare tell anyone that she was autistic because she feared that she would her treatment would be prejudiced by telling us as healthcare professionals that fact. She said had she seen someone wearing a badge which showed that they were there to care, listen and understand, she would have opened up to them. So I think we have to, as healthcare professionals, be prepared to accept that we have to change our mindsets for the benefit of our patients.
Thank you, Ginny. That's really powerful, and I think an important message to sort of conclude the panel conversation on today. I would thank the panel immensely, and I know I speak on their behalf when I thank everyone for their questions. I think what we want to do is keep this conversation live, and we want to not lose the drive that I think we've just discussed and the answers to the questions we've heard today. So taking this forward, the campaign is going to continue to run, grow, take over the world, as Ginny suggested. We're gonna do more with BMIX and bring in that context into the acute setting and hopefully across the ICP and the ICS. And we want to keep Mary close to this as well, to keep guiding us as an expert and someone who's probably further down this journey than we are locally and can bring a lot of context for us. So I hope this isn't the only time we speak about this in the coming months, and I'm pretty sure we'll have another big conversation like this where we talk about our progress and our development. I think these topics and this fora is designed for the purpose of having conversations that challenge the way we work as organisations. There's been some topics before, and there'll come some topics after that hold a light up a bit and say, are we doing this right? And if we're not, how can we do it better and how can we do it differently? And I think what we've heard today is there's some parity of esteem here around how we do our day jobs and how we treat our colleagues and how our patients receive our care. But there's also something about saying if we brought standards up, and there's a great comment in the questions about bringing standards up to the pieces we've just said today, will be good for everyone. And it doesn't need to be different for specific groups. It can just be better all round. And I think we should aspire to that. And we're really lucky. I'll put a personal pitch in on Ginny. We're so lucky to have Ginny putting this work front and forward for us. I'm very honoured to have met Matt and Mary as well. And colleagues, thank you for joining. Any last words from you before we close, Matt?
Just to echo those thanks, and it's been so enriching to hear from Ginny as a parent and a campaigner and healthcare professional, Mary from your lived experience and professional experience as well, and I'm just so pleased that this is on the agenda. It's these kinds of conversations that will really help take that parity of esteem forward. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Mary, any last comments from you?
I'm just really looking forward to seeing the campaign spread nationwide and possibly even to Ireland.
Oh yes. Ginny, last words to you.
Thank you to the Institute for allowing us to have this conversation, to keep the momentum going. That's what I really want to do now, is keep the momentum going. But if any of my colleagues at the Trust have not got a badge yet, please come and find me and I will give you one. Thank you.
We will make sure of that. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions. For anything we haven't covered, Sophie, our colleague in the Institute, will make sure we cover those items off and we'll get comments back. And I'll be lobbying hard to make sure there's another conversation like this early next year, if not sooner, around the progress we're making. And by then, Ginny would have taken over the world with the campaign. So we'll no doubt be in all the public news. So it's great to have you all here. Thank you so much. And I'll look forward to speaking to everybody again. And thanks to the Institute.